thought she was simply helping a family in danger. She didn't realize her courage would change the way two worlds saw each other forever. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The spring of 1878 had been unusually wet in the Dakota Territory. For weeks, heavy rains pounded the rolling plains, turning the normally docile creeks into raging torrents. Sarah Thornton, a young widow who had moved west from Boston after losing her husband in the Civil War, stood at the doorway of her modest homestead, watching the darkening skies with growing concern. "This ain't normal," muttered old Pete, her nearest neighbor who had stopped by to help secure her livestock. "Been in these parts 20 years. Never seen the Cottonwood Creek rise this high." Sarah nodded, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. At 32, she had learned to face hardship with quiet determination. 5 years of working the land alone had given her calloused hands and an unshakable resolve, but something about the relentless rain filled her with dread. "I should check on the Henderson family," she said, pulling her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Martha's expecting twins any day now." Old Pete frowned, his weathered face creasing with worry. "The Hendersons? You mean them Lakota folk living down by the bend?" "Sarah, that's 5 miles in this weather." "They're not Hendersons, Pete. His name is Running Elk, and his wife is Morning Star," Sarah corrected gently. "And yes, they need checking on. Their cabin sits lower than ours, right by the creek." Pete shook his head. "Never understood why you took to them Indians like you did. Most folks around here wouldn't give 'em the time of day." Sarah turned to face the old man, her green eyes flashing. "They're people, Pete. Morning Star taught me how to use native plants when I had that terrible cough last winter. Their little girl, Willa, brings me wildflowers every time they pass by." Before Pete could respond, a distant rumble of thunder shook the cabin. Sarah made up her mind. "I'm going. If the creek's rising as fast as you say, they might need help." "You're as stubborn as that mule of yours," Pete sighed. "At least take my slicker. Storm's only getting worse." 20 minutes later, Sarah was guiding her horse Biscuit carefully along the muddy trail. The rain fell in sheets, reducing visibility to mere yards ahead. The normally peaceful countryside had transformed into something ominous. Trees bending against the wind, fields turning to shallow lakes. When she reached the rise overlooking Running Elk's cabin, Sarah's heart sank. The creek had already breached its banks, surrounding the small log structure. Water swirled around the foundation, rising visibly with each passing minute. "Hello," she called out, dismounting and tying Biscuit to a sturdy oak. "Running Elk. Morning Star." At first, only the howling wind answered. Then the cabin door burst open, and Running Elk emerged, carrying his 5-year-old daughter. His normally stoic face was creased with worry. "Miss Sarah," he shouted over the storm. "The water comes too fast." Sarah waded toward them, the cold water quickly rising past her knees. "Where is Morning Star?" "Inside. The babies. They come early with the storm." Sarah's eyes widened. "The twins. Now?" Running Elk nodded grimly. "2 boys, born just as water began rising. She is weak. I was about to try moving them to higher ground." Sarah pushed past him into the cabin. Inside, Morning Star lay on the bed, her copper face glistening with sweat despite the chill. Beside her, wrapped in deerskin blankets, were 2 tiny infants, their dark eyes blinking in the dim light. "The spirits bring you," Morning Star whispered, reaching for Sarah's hand. "The water rises too quickly. Save my sons." Sarah assessed the situation rapidly. The cabin floor was already covered in an inch of water, and the level was climbing steadily. Morning Star was clearly too weak to walk, and Running Elk couldn't carry his wife and both newborns while leading their daughter through the floodwaters. "We need to move now," Sarah decided. "Running Elk, can you carry Morning Star?" The man nodded, handing little Willa over to Sarah. "I can." "Good, I'll take the twins and Willa. We need to get to higher ground immediately." With practiced gentleness, Sarah bundled each tiny infant inside her shawl, securing them against her chest. She then took Willa's hand, trying to project a calmness she didn't feel as the water continued to rise around them. "It's going to be an adventure, little one," she told the frightened child. "We need to be brave like the eagle. Remember the stories your father tells? Willa nodded solemnly, her small fingers gripping Sarah's with surprising strength. Outside, the world had transformed into chaos. The creek, now a raging river, had risen even higher in the brief time Sarah had been inside. What had been knee-deep water was now swirling around her waist, threatening to sweep her off her feet with each step. "We need to angle toward that ridge," Sarah shouted to Running Elk, who followed closely behind with Morning Star in his arms. The current's too strong to cross directly. Each step was a battle against the powerful current. Sarah kept the precious bundle of newborns high against her chest, while using her free arm to guide Willa, who was now practically swimming beside her. The child's face was a mask of determination beyond her years. Halfway to the ridge, disaster struck. A massive section of creek bank collapsed upstream, sending a new surge of water toward them. Sarah barely had time to lift Willa into her arms before the wave hit, nearly knocking her off her feet. "Hold on!" she screamed, struggling to maintain her footing while protecting 3 children against her body. Running Elk wasn't so fortunate. The wave caught him sideways, sending both him and Morning Star tumbling into the deeper water. Sarah watched in horror as they disappeared beneath the churning surface, only to reappear several yards downstream, clinging desperately to a half-submerged tree. "Go!" Running Elk shouted when he saw Sarah hesitate. "Get children to safety. We will follow." With the babies wailing against her chest and Willa now clinging to her neck, Sarah fought her way through the floodwaters, each step a victory against nature's fury. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed in protest, but the precious weight against her body drove her forward. By the time Sarah reached the ridge, the rain had finally begun to slacken, though the angry gray clouds still hung low in the sky. She gently laid the twin boys on a patch of relatively dry grass beneath a sheltering pine, then helped Willa sit beside them. "Watch your brothers," she instructed the solemn-faced child. "I need to help your parents." Willa nodded, immediately taking up her role as protector with the gravity that only a 5-year-old could muster. "I will sing to them the song my mother teaches," she said, beginning a soft Lakota lullaby that seemed strangely peaceful against the backdrop of the storm. Sarah turned back toward the flood, scanning desperately for Running Elk and Morning Star. She spotted them still clinging to the tree, which had now lodged against a boulder. They were alive but clearly exhausted, the tree threatening to break free with each surge of the current. Without hesitation, Sarah waded back into the floodwaters. She was halfway to them when she heard shouting from behind. Turning, she was astonished to see 3 riders approaching the ridge. Old Pete, and 2 men from town she recognized as the Johnson brothers. "Sarah Thornton, you crazy woman," Pete was bellowing. "We followed your tracks when the storm eased." Sarah had never been so grateful to see the cantankerous old man. "Pete, help the children on the ridge. There's newborn twins, and we need rope for Running Elk and his wife." The Johnson brothers, Tom and Daniel, dismounted quickly. Daniel stayed with the children while Tom joined Sarah at the edge of the floodwaters, uncoiling a length of sturdy rope from his saddle. "Ma'am, you shouldn't go back in there," Tom cautioned, his young face serious beneath his dripping hat. "Then throw true, Mr. Johnson," Sarah replied, pointing to where Running Elk and Morning Star clung to the tree. "That man saved my crop last autumn when blight hit. I won't leave him now." Tom nodded, understanding the frontier code of mutual aid that transcended the usual prejudices. With practiced skill, he swung the rope several times before letting it fly across the churning water. The first throw fell short, but the second landed perfectly across Running Elk's shoulders. Sarah held her breath as the exhausted man secured the rope around his wife and himself. The Johnson brothers began to pull, fighting against both the current and the weight of 2 waterlogged adults. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the rope might snap, but inch by inch they drew the couple to safety. When Running Elk and Morning Star finally collapsed on the ridge, Sarah quickly checked them for injuries. Morning Star was alarmingly pale, her breathing shallow. "She needs shelter and warmth immediately," Sarah said, looking up at the men. "The childbirth and then this. It's too much." Pete nodded grimly. "My place is closest, about a mile north." Running Elk, despite his exhaustion, insisted on carrying his wife. "My feet will find the way," he said, though Sarah noticed he had lost his moccasins in the flood and his feet were already bleeding from the rough terrain. They made an unusual procession, Sarah cradling the twin boys, Tom Johnson carrying little Willa, Running Elk bearing Morning Star in his arms, while Pete and Daniel led the horses. The rain had dwindled to a gentle patter, but the damage was evident all around them. Uprooted trees, drowned livestock, and the distant sight of other homesteads surrounded by water. Never seen flooding like this, Pete muttered as they trudged along. Simmons' place is completely underwater. Miller's lost their entire barn. Sarah barely registered his words, her attention fixed on the tiny lives nestled against her chest. Despite everything, both babies seemed remarkably strong, their tiny fists occasionally punching the air, as if protesting the day they'd chosen to enter the world. "They have warrior spirits," Running Elk commented, noticing her gaze. "Born in storm waters, carried to safety by a woman with eagle's courage. Just doing what anyone would," Sarah demurred. Running Elk's dark eyes met hers with intensity. "No, not what anyone would do. What you did, my people will not forget." By the time they reached Pete's cabin, Morning Star had developed a fever, slipping in and out of consciousness. Sarah immediately took charge, directing the men to stoke the fire while she tended to the exhausted mother. "I need clean linens, hot water, and whatever medicinal herbs you have, Pete," she instructed, her previous life as a doctor's wife in Boston providing knowledge that proved invaluable on the frontier. "There's willow bark in that tin," Pete replied, pointing to his crude cupboard, "and I reckon I can find some clean shirts to tear up." For the next few hours, Sarah worked tirelessly, bathing Morning Star's feverish body with cool cloths while preparing a willow bark tea for when she awakened. The twins, remarkably, seemed content to sleep bundled together near the fire, while Willa sat sentinel beside them, occasionally stroking their dark hair with gentle fingers. Running Elk remained by his wife's side, his stoic expression betraying only occasional flashes of fear when Morning Star's breathing became particularly labored. Though he had wrapped his bleeding feet in strips of cloth, Sarah could see the pain in his eyes whenever he shifted position. "You should let me look at those feet," she said softly. He shook his head. "My wife and sons first." "Your sons are healthy and strong," Sarah assured him, "and Morning Star's fever is beginning to break. Please let me help you now." Reluctantly, Running Elk allowed her to examine his feet. The damage was worse than she'd feared, deep cuts and the beginning signs of infection. Working methodically, she cleaned the wounds with whiskey from Pete's supply, ignoring the stoic man's occasional sharp intake of breath. "You'll need to stay off these feet for at least a week," she said firmly. Running Elk frowned. "My family needs shelter. Our home is gone." "You'll stay right here," old Pete interjected unexpectedly from across the room. "Least till the waters recede and we can see what's salvageable." The Lakota man looked up in surprise. Pete had never shown his family anything but grudging tolerance before. Pete shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "Any man who'd carry his wife through flood water with feet cut to ribbons deserves a proper chance to heal up," he muttered. "Besides, Miss Sarah here would have my hide if I suggested otherwise." As evening fell, the Johnson brothers departed to check on other neighbors, promising to return the next day with supplies. Sarah sat by the fire, one of the twin boys cradled in her arms, while Running Elk held the other. Morning Star slept peacefully now, her fever broken, with Willa curled like a small cat at her side. "What will you name them?" Sarah asked softly, tracing a finger along the sleeping infant's perfect cheek. Running Elk studied his sons thoughtfully. "This one," he said, indicating the baby in his arms, "will be called Brave Water, for he cried the loudest when the flood came." Then, looking at the child Sarah held, he added, "And this one will be called Hawk's Friend, to honor the woman who carried them through the storm." Sarah felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. "I'm no hawk," she protested gently. "To my people, the hawk represents courage and protection," Running Elk explained. "Like you, it carries precious things safely through dangerous skies." Outside, the storm had finally passed completely, revealing a star-filled night. Though the floodwaters still surrounded them, Sarah felt a curious sense of peace as she gazed down at the sleeping child in her arms, his tiny fingers curled trustingly around her thumb. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt truly needed, not just as a neighbor offering occasional help, but as someone whose actions had made the difference between life and death. The realization settled over her like a warm blanket, pushing back the loneliness that had been her constant companion for so long. "You should sleep," Running Elk said, breaking into her thoughts. "Tomorrow brings new challenges." Sarah nodded, carefully placing Hawk's friend beside his brother in the makeshift cradle Pete had constructed from a wooden box. As she watched the twins sleeping peacefully, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect unison, she wondered what tomorrow would indeed bring for all of them. The days following the flood blended together in a haze of exhaustion and constant activity. The waters receded slowly, revealing a transformed landscape of mud-caked fields, collapsed structures, and scattered debris. Sarah divided her time between caring for Morning Star and the twins at Pete's cabin, and salvaging what she could from her own homestead, which had mercifully suffered only minor damage due to its position on higher ground. Running Elk's cabin, however, had not fared as well. When Sarah accompanied him to assess the damage a week after the flood, they found only the stone chimney still standing, a lonely sentinel marking where a home had once been. "Everything gone," Running Elk said quietly, surveying the scene. Though his feet were healing, he still walked with a pronounced limp, leaning heavily on a walking stick Sarah had fashioned for him. Sarah placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Not everything. Your family is safe." He nodded slowly, his dark eyes scanning the mud-covered clearing where his garden had been. "This was to be our permanent home. The Indian agent said if we farmed like white men, lived in a house like white men, we could stay. Now." His voice trailed off, but Sarah understood the unspoken fear. The plight of the Lakota people was precarious at best. Running Elk's family had been allowed to settle on this small parcel, only because he had worked as a scout for the army years before. Without a proper dwelling and crops to show the authorities, they might be forced onto the reservation at Standing Rock, far from the land they had come to call home. "We'll rebuild," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "The whole community is helping each other recover." Running Elk gave her a measured look. "Your community helps each other. My family is not part of your community." "You are to me," Sarah replied firmly. "And to Pete now, though he'd never admit it outright. Even the Johnson brothers ask after your boys each time they stop by." Before Running Elk could respond, they heard the approach of horses. Sarah turned to see 3 riders coming down the muddy trail: Tom Johnson, the blacksmith's son Mark Willis, and to her surprise, Reverend Clark from the small church in town. "Miss Thornton," Reverend Clark called as they approached, tipping his hat. "We've been looking for you." Sarah straightened, unconsciously moving slightly in front of Running Elk in a protective gesture. The Reverend was known for his harsh views on the Indian problem, as he called it. "What can I do for you, Reverend?" she asked, her tone deliberately neutral. The Reverend dismounted, his eyes taking in the destroyed cabin and the stoic Lakota man standing beside Sarah. "Word has spread about what happened during the flood, about how you saved this man's family." Sarah felt a flush of discomfort. "I only did what needed doing. Nonetheless, it was a Christian act of charity," the Reverend continued. He turned to Running Elk with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. "Mr. Running Elk, I understand you've lost your home." Running Elk nodded once, his face impassive. The Reverend cleared his throat. "The church committee met last night. In light of recent events and considering your past service to the Army, we've decided to help you rebuild. Properly this time." Sarah blinked in surprise. "You have?" Tom Johnson spoke up. "We've got lumber from the mill, nails from the blacksmith, and about a dozen men ready to work. Figure we can have a solid cabin up in less than a week." Mark Willis nodded in agreement. "My pa says anyone who names his son after Miss Sarah deserves a proper roof over his head." Sarah felt her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She glanced at Running Elk, whose stoic expression had given way to evident shock. "Why would you do this?" he asked directly, his eyes fixed on the Reverend. Reverend Clark shifted uncomfortably. "I've preached plenty about loving thy neighbor, Mr. Running Elk. Perhaps it's time I practiced it as well." He paused, then added more quietly, "And perhaps I've been too quick to judge where certain matters are concerned." The significance of this admission wasn't lost on Sarah. The Reverend's change of heart represented something far more valuable than lumber or nails. It was the first crack in the wall of prejudice that had long separated Running Elk's family from the wider community. For the next 5 days, Sarah watched in amazement as men from town worked alongside Running Elk to construct a new cabin, larger and sturdier than the original. Women she barely knew from church brought food for the workers and gifts for the twins. Even the Indian agent, when he came to assess flood damage, seemed impressed by the community effort. "Never seen anything quite like it," he commented to Sarah as they watched the roof being raised. What changed their minds about him? Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think seeing him carry his wife through floodwater with bleeding feet made them recognize his humanity. It's harder to cling to prejudice when you've witnessed someone's courage and love for their family." By the time Morning Star was strong enough to leave Pete's cabin, her new home was ready. Sarah helped her settle in, arranging the modest gifts from townspeople, blankets, cookware, and a handcrafted cradle large enough for both twins. "Our people have a saying," Morning Star told Sarah as they worked. "The most powerful warrior is the one who makes an enemy into a friend. You have done this for us." Sarah shook her head. "I didn't do it alone." "No," Morning Star agreed, her gentle hands arranging the twins in their new cradle. "But you were the first to see us as people, not as Lakota. Others followed your path." That evening, as Sarah prepared to return to her own homestead for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, Running Elk approached her outside the new cabin. The setting sun cast long shadows across the clearing, gilding the freshly cut wood of the structure with warm light. "My people believe that when a life is saved, it creates a bond that cannot be broken," he said solemnly. "You saved 4 lives that day." Sarah thought of her own life before the flood, the long, lonely days working her land, the quiet evenings with only memories for company. "Perhaps you saved me as well," she replied softly. "I've been alone for so long." Running Elk nodded in understanding. The white man's path and the Lakota path are different, but sometimes they cross. When they do, there is an opportunity for new understanding. As if to emphasize his point, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Sarah turned to see Tom Johnson riding toward them, his tall figure silhouetted against the evening sky. "Miss Sarah," he called, pulling his horse to a stop nearby. "Thought I might escort you back to your place. Getting dark soon." Sarah noticed the way Tom's eyes lingered on her face, the respectful nod he gave to Running Elk. In the past weeks, the young man had been a constant presence, helping with rebuilding efforts while finding numerous excuses to work near wherever Sarah happened to be. "That would be kind, Mr. Johnson," she replied, suddenly conscious of how her hair must look after a day of work. Running Elk watched this exchange with knowing eyes. Before Sarah mounted her horse, he spoke again, his voice low enough that only she could hear. The crossing of paths sometimes leads to a shared journey. As Sarah rode beside Tom through the golden evening light, she found herself considering Running Elk's words. For 5 years since her husband's death, she had walked her path alone, convinced that her life's purpose was simply to survive. Now, watching Tom's profile against the sunset, feeling the comfortable silence between them, she wondered if perhaps there might be more. "The twins are growing stronger every day," Tom commented as they rode. "Quite the miracle considering everything." Sarah smiled, thinking of the tiny boys she had carried through floodwaters. "Life finds a way, even in the harshest circumstances." "Like you," Tom said, his voice suddenly earnest. "Everyone talks about how you never complained after losing your husband, just built your life here piece by piece." "I did what needed doing," Sarah replied, echoing the words she'd said so often lately. Tom guided his horse closer to hers. "That's what folks admire about you, Miss Sarah. You see what needs doing and you do it, regardless of what others might think. Carrying those Indian babies to safety, standing up to the Reverend when he was being bullheaded about helping Running Elk." "Tom Johnson, are you suggesting I'm stubborn?" Sarah asked with mock seriousness. His laugh rang out in the quiet evening. "Determined is the word I'd use, and brave." He paused, then added more softly, "And about the prettiest woman in the Dakota Territory." Sarah felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. "Mr. Johnson, you shouldn't say such things." "Why not?" he challenged gently. "It's the truth as I see it." As they approached her homestead, the familiar silhouette of her cabin against the darkening sky stirred something in Sarah's heart. Not the usual sense of solitary pride, but a new feeling. one of possibilities not yet explored. "Will you come to the naming ceremony?" she asked as they reached her door. Running Elk has invited the whole town to witness the formal naming of the twins this Sunday. It's an important Lakota tradition. Tom nodded, his eyes holding hers. "I wouldn't miss it for anything. May I call for you that day? Escort you there?" Sarah hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, I think I'd like that very much." As she watched him ride away, Sarah stood in her doorway, the same spot where she had watched the storm clouds gathering 2 weeks earlier. The landscape before her was forever changed by the flood, just as she herself had been transformed by what followed. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the prairie stretching to the horizon under a boundless blue sky that seemed to wash away the memory of the recent floods. Sarah stood before her small mirror, adjusting the collar of her best dress, a deep blue calico she hadn't worn since Easter. She had taken extra care with her appearance today, even unpinning her usual practical bun to let her auburn hair fall in loose waves down her back. A knock at the door announced Tom's arrival. When she opened it, the expression on his face made her blush. "Miss Sarah," he said, removing his hat, "you look beautiful." "Thank you, Tom," she replied, noticing he had traded his work clothes for a clean shirt and his Sunday suit. His dark hair was neatly combed, though a stubborn cowlick at his crown refused to lie flat. Tom helped her into his wagon, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. As they drove toward Running Elk's new cabin, Sarah was struck by how different this journey felt from their daily trips during the rebuilding. There was a sense of anticipation, of something important about to unfold. "Quite a turnout," Tom commented as they approached the clearing. Sarah was astonished to see at least 30 people gathered around Running Elk's cabin, nearly the entire community. Reverend Clark stood talking with the Indian agent. The blacksmith and his wife had brought their children. Even old Pete had made an appearance, looking uncomfortable in a faded suit coat that must have been decades old. "I never expected so many would come," Sarah murmured as Tom helped her down from the wagon. "Word spread," he replied. "First Lakota naming ceremony most folks have ever been invited to. Besides," he added with a gentle smile, "people want to see the babies you carried through the flood. They're calling it a miracle." "It was no miracle," Sarah protested. "Just doing what needed doing." Tom laughed softly. "You keep saying that. One day you'll have to accept that what comes naturally to you seems extraordinary to the rest of us." Before Sarah could respond, Running Elk approached them, dressed in a striking combination of traditional Lakota garments and frontier clothing. The healing cuts on his bare feet were now visible as badges of honor rather than wounds. "Sarah Thornton," he greeted her formally. "We are honored by your presence on this day." "The honor is mine," she replied. "I'm overwhelmed to see so many here." Running Elk's normally stoic expression softened. "The people came first out of curiosity, then out of respect. Today, perhaps some come out of friendship." He nodded to Tom. "The ceremony will begin soon. Sarah, Morning Star asks if you would join the women inside first." Inside the cabin, Morning Star was dressed in a beautiful deerskin dress adorned with intricate beadwork, her long black hair plaited with red ribbons. The twins, now nearly 3 weeks old, were wrapped in new blankets decorated with traditional Lakota symbols. "These are gifts from my mother's people," Morning Star explained, touching the blankets. "They traveled 4 days when they heard of the flood and the twins' birth." Sarah noticed several older Lakota women in the cabin she hadn't seen before, their weathered faces regarding her with curious but not unfriendly expressions. "My grandmother wishes to give you something," Morning Star said, gesturing to the eldest woman, whose face was a map of fine wrinkles surrounding sharp, observant eyes. The old woman approached Sarah, holding out a small pouch of soft leather. When Sarah accepted it, the woman spoke in Lakota, her voice surprisingly strong. Morning Star translated, "She says this is eagle medicine, very powerful. The eagle flies between the world of earth and sky, carrying messages to the spirits, like you carried our babies between the world of water and land." Touched by the gesture, Sarah carefully placed the pouch in her pocket. "Please thank her for me. Tell her I will treasure it always." The old woman studied Sarah's face intently, then spoke again. "She says your path is changing. You carried our children through water, but someone will soon carry your heart through life." Sarah felt her cheeks warm, thinking of Tom waiting outside. Morningstar smiled knowingly but said nothing more as she handed one of the twins to Sarah. You will carry Hawk's friend into the circle, as is proper for his namesake. The ceremony itself was unlike anything the white settlers had seen before. Running Elk had created a circle of stones in front of the cabin, with 4 larger stones marking the cardinal directions. The entire community gathered around this circle as Running Elk invited them to witness the formal naming of his sons. Sarah stood beside Morningstar, cradling Hawk's friend, while one of Morningstar's relatives held Brave Water. Running Elk began with a prayer in Lakota, his deep voice carrying across the hushed gathering. He then switched to English, explaining the significance of the naming ceremony. In our way, a name is not just what you are called, it is who you are. It tells your story and connects you to all who came before. Today we give our sons their true names, so all may know their story. He took Brave Water from his relative's arms, holding the infant toward the sky. This one came into the world as the waters rose, crying so loudly that even the thunder noticed. He will be known as Brave Water, for he fears nothing, not even the day of his birth. The crowd murmured appreciatively as Running Elk then turned to Sarah, gesturing for her to bring forward the second twin. With all eyes upon her, Sarah stepped into the stone circle, carefully handing Hawk's friend to his father. Running Elk again raised the child skyward. This one came into the world quietly, watching everything with calm eyes. When the flood threatened to take him, he was carried to safety by a woman with the courage of a hawk and the heart of a friend. He will be known as Hawk's friend, to honor the one who saved him, and to remind him always that courage comes in many forms. Running Elk then surprised everyone by continuing. In the old days, when a person saved the life of another, they became family, closer than blood. Sarah Thornton carried my sons through danger at risk to herself. By our ways, she is now family to these boys. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as Running Elk placed Hawk's friend back in her arms. The baby gazed up at her with solemn dark eyes that seemed impossibly wise for one so young. As family, Running Elk continued, she will always have a place at our fire, and my sons will know her as the one who gave them the chance to grow into men. Reverend Clark stepped forward then, asking if he might offer a Christian blessing as well. Running Elk agreed readily, and the Reverend spoke of bridges between peoples, of finding common ground even when paths seemed separate. As he finished, Sarah noticed many in the crowd nodding thoughtfully, including some who had previously expressed the harshest views about the Lakota. After the ceremony, the gathering transformed into an impromptu celebration. The women from town had brought food, which mingled with traditional Lakota dishes prepared by Morningstar's relatives. Children played together regardless of heritage, while adults engaged in conversations that would have been unimaginable just weeks before. Sarah found herself seated on a log beside Tom, watching the scene with a sense of wonder. "Did you ever think you'd see the day?" Tom asked, his shoulder warm against hers. "Reverend Clark sharing a meal with Lakota elders?" Sarah shook her head. "It seems the flood washed away more than just buildings. Waters of change," Tom agreed. He hesitated, then added, "Speaking of change, Miss Sarah, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Before he could continue, they were interrupted by old Pete, who shuffled over with a plate of food. "Never thought I'd develop a taste for Indian cooking," he grumbled, though he was clearly enjoying the meal. "That stew with the wild turnips ain't half bad." Sarah smiled up at him. "Pete, I never properly thanked you for taking in Running Elk's family during the flood. It was a kindness I won't forget." The old man shifted uncomfortably. "Weren't nothing. Besides, them little boys grew on me. Got lungs like bellows, both of 'em." His weathered face softened slightly. "Reminds me of my own boys, long time back." This was the first Sarah had heard of Pete having children. The revelation offered a glimpse into the lonely man's past that explained much about his gruff exterior. After Pete moved on, Tom turned back to Sarah. "As I was saying, Miss Sarah, these past weeks working alongside you, getting to know you better." He took a deep breath. "Well, I've come to care for you deeply." Sarah felt her heart quicken. "Tom, I know it might seem sudden," he hurried on, "but life out here has a way of showing us what matters. When I saw you carry those babies through the flood, I knew you were the bravest, most caring woman I'd ever meet." He took her hand in his. I'm not asking for promises yet, just permission to court you properly, to see where this path might lead us." Sarah looked across the gathering, at Running Elk and Morning Star with their children, at the unlikely community that had formed in the aftermath of disaster, at the new cabin standing where destruction had been. The old Lakota woman's words echoed in her mind. "Your path is changing." She turned back to Tom, whose honest eyes watched her with hopeful anticipation. "Yes," she said simply. "I think I'd like that very much." His face broke into a radiant smile, and he squeezed her hand gently. "I promise you won't regret it, Miss Sarah." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the gathering, Running Elk approached Sarah once more. He carried both twins now, their tiny faces peaceful in sleep. "Before you leave," he said, "I wanted to thank you once more, not just for saving my family, but for helping our peoples find common ground." Sarah glanced at Tom, who stood respectfully nearby. "I think we all found something in the aftermath of the flood. New beginnings often come from the most unexpected places." Running Elk nodded sagely, looking between Sarah and Tom with knowing eyes. "The waters that threatened to take everything instead brought gifts we could not have imagined." He handed Hawk's friend to Sarah one last time. "He will know your story, how you walked through dangerous waters to bring him to safety. And someday, when he is a man, he will walk many miles to thank you himself." Sarah cradled the sleeping infant, memorizing his perfect features, the tiny fingers curled into fists, the peaceful rise and fall of his chest. In saving this child, she had found her own salvation. A new family, a new community, and perhaps, glancing at Tom, a new chance at love. As they prepared to leave, Tom helped Sarah into his wagon, his hand once again lingering on hers. The touch felt like a promise, like the first words of a new story beginning to unfold. "What are you thinking about?" he asked as they started toward home, the setting sun painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Sarah looked back at the gathering one last time, the unlikely blend of cultures, the shared food and conversation, the new cabin standing as testament to what people could accomplish together. "I'm thinking that sometimes it takes a flood to show us the higher ground," she replied softly. Tom's hand found hers in the fading light, warm and steady. As they rode into the evening, Sarah felt a sense of certainty settle over her. The flood had forever altered the landscape of their community, washing away old prejudices and creating space for new connections. And in carrying those two tiny Lakota twins to safety, she had unwittingly carried herself toward a future brighter than she had dared to imagine.